Just to talk a little bit about what we're going to talk about today, we're going to be mainly just focusing on page writing, formatting, the words on the page. There are a lot of questions that come in on a regular basis, as there should be. We're all trying to figure out what's the so-called right way to be, putting our script together. And they're all good questions. There are no bad or dumb questions in screenwriting in general, much less in the page formatting portion of the writing process. But there's a lot to cover. There are a lot of individual things that we want to talk about. And I'm going to try to hit them all with some visual, examples and things. However, I'm going to start with a little bit of a disclaimer where page writing is concerned, where formatting is concerned. And try not to take this like 100%, okay, Max said that, great. Everything's relative in the creative process. But with that being said, the best advice, like if I had to stop the webinar in the next 60 seconds, this is what I would say. As long as it's easy to understand on the page for the reader, and you're using the same approach in terms of the formatting throughout the whole script, meaning the same style of scene heading, if you're going to use a comma, that comma better always be used and not sometimes use a hyphen. If I tend to gravitate toward a hyphen in a scene heading, just because the general rule is to have, when you're referencing day or night at the end of your scene heading, it's hyphen day or night. Rarely, if ever, should we be seeing a comma day or night. It's almost always hyphen day night. So if you use a comma, which you can do this, if you do a comma like Max's bedroom, comma, that bedroom is a bad idea or bad example. It's Max's house, comma, Max's bed, bedroom hyphen day or something. Then that's fine. You can do comma and hyphen, but that you better keep that format the whole way through the script. So that would be the general piece of information I can give you here, the general piece of advice. Just do the same thing then. If you're going to choose one way to do it, do the same thing. If you're going to always capitalize and bold your scene heading, well, of course it's going to be capitalized, but if it's always going to be bolded, it better always be bolded. Things like the way you describe a character, just follow the same format. If you have descriptions in parentheses, which I don't tend to like that much, but you can do it, then your descriptions better always be in parentheses. It's that kind of thing. This is a lot simpler than we sometimes make it out to be as far as page writing and formatting. First and foremost, get some form of screenwriting software. If you're not using a screenwriting software, you're going to end up doing it quote unquote wrong. Readers will notice. There are inexpensive ways. You don't have to drop $400 or $500 on Final Draft, even though that is technically industry standard. There are other programs that are a little less expensive. WriterDuet.com, I think, is like $20 a month. And it looks just like Movie Magic Screenwriter and Final Draft, and you can print to a PDF. It's all done online. So there are inexpensive ways to do it. So make sure you've got some screenwriting software. Lastly, I want to say, I get a lot of questions from my writers when I'm working with them, one-on-one or in the workshops that I host and all these things. They start a question about formatting with, is it okay to ... Like, is it okay to do this? And my answer is almost always, yeah, it's fine. As long as it's clear and it's easy to see and understand on the page in terms of, here's the visual, always come from a visual standpoint. This is a visual medium we're working in. There are times where you can use kind of some emotional quips here and there, some non-visual references, but you want to keep that relatively light. So just to basically answer the question, if you are coming up with the question in your head, like, is it okay to do this? Sure, but make sure you just do that all the time. Whatever you choose to do, make sure it follows the format throughout the whole script. That's when things start to get a little messy. The reader, it does something to the reader's eyes because the reader gets used to that type of approach. So I just wanted to start with that. We have a whole bunch of other things we're going to cover. A couple of announcements. Felicity Wren is the co-VP of development for Creative Screenwriter Productions, our production arm, alongside me. She's also the director of development for the ISA and the development slate. She and I work together on pitching material that we have on our slate that is represented by our agent and agency. And we go out and we're pitching projects all the time. She's also on the phone all the time with various executives and producers, et cetera. We are launching a pitch class that will be available. Unlimited number of people can jump in. There is an option to add a little bit of, it's for a small fee, you can add a purchase to get feedback on your log line and pitch. But we're going to talk about everything from, behind the curtain in terms of how the industry expects pitches, what pitches look like, the various types of pitches, because not all of them are always verbal. We'll talk about ISA writing gigs a little bit. We'll talk about pitch decks. There's going to be a lot. And I'll post that on thecraftcourse.com soon, but I just wanted to let all you know. I'm having a mini retreat in Los Angeles. So if you're local to LA, it's going to be a non-overnight stay type of retreat for about 2.5 days in the Valley, just north of Encino. If you wanted to ask me about that, you can just email me. It's going to include dinner and drinks and a whole bunch of writing time, lectures, live community with writers. We have a pool at the house. You can swim if you want. And we're also launching, I know a lot of 30-day challenge writers were eager to hear about this, but hasn't been launched yet, but I'm working on launching an office hours membership. It's going to be really inexpensive. And I'm going to have regular office hours every week where I'm just going to come in to Q&A section. People can come in and ask questions, or just, I'll have topics to chat about every now and then. I believe we're going to price that at $29 a month. It might be $19. I'm not sure yet, so don't quote me on either of those prices. The reason we haven't launched it yet is because we're working on creating a forum that is very much like Facebook, that anybody who has the office hours membership will be able to access that forum and communicate with other writers outside of those office hours. That's pretty much it. I was going to talk a little bit about my consulting and personal coaching. I have very limited space, but if you wanted to work with me, you can email me. You came on here not for sales pitch, but to talk about page formatting. So if you have any questions about any of the stuff I just mentioned, just email me, max@thestoryfarm.org. All right. So we are talking about everything from, just going to list a whole bunch of things here: parentheticals, scene headings, transitions, the use of continuous in scene headings. I'm going to talk a little bit about show, don't tell, which is kind of straightforward, and I think you all know what that means. Scene direction rules in general. Word choice is really important. The pacing of a scene is really important. Flashbacks, montages, when and why words should be capitalized. Telephone conversations, which is a very difficult thing to discuss because there's so many different ways you can do it, and character descriptions. But then I'm also going to talk about some passive word choice versus active word choice stuff. So we're going to cover a lot here. This is being recorded, so don't worry too much about having to take crazy notes. If you have questions about anything, you can post it in the comment section here. But I may miss it because people, are commenting and stuff. But if you have a specific question, you can put it in the Q&A portion down at the bottom of your screen here. You can post it right there. Larry is asking, I'm going to cover this really quick. I signed up for an ISA course and never received a password. I emailed once about this and got no response. What do I do? Sorry, Larry, that's very strange. So for one, if you sign up for a course, that course is likely through thecraftcourse.com. So that's a separate login. It's a different login than your ISA website login. You may already know that, but I just want to make sure that's covered. If you can't figure out your password, email me at my ISA address, max@networkisa.org, and I'll figure it out. I'll go in, I'll try to find your profile and stuff. And sorry, Larry, I don't know why that happened, but you should have been able to create your own password. But anyway, we'll get that figured out, Larry. So Kathleen is saying this is exactly what I need. Thank you. Okay. So I'm not going to go into any kind of, I'll start here because this is the most important. There's no ranking here. They're all kind of equally important. Parentheticals. And I'm going to go through these relatively quickly because I don't know how much of an explanation each and every single one of them needs, because most of this can be assumed that you're all very smart people. These are the types of things that once you hear it, it's like, oh, okay, fine. I can do it that way. But again, everything's relative here. I'm going to show 3 different versions of scripts. One of which is mine, which wasn't produced. 2 of the other ones were. But you'll see, how everything's relative. But we'll start with parentheticals because I see this a lot. The main thing to remember about parentheticals is that it's primarily to aid in the reader's experience, not necessarily something for the director or the actor to see. And that's what we have to remember when we're writing a screenplay. Once we're done with it, and once we're lucky enough to be able to get the thing funded and it's being produced and you're actually shooting it, it's kind of out of our hands a little bit, right? I mean, the director and the photographer and the editors, they're going to pretty much take that on, and it's their project. So from a parenthetical standpoint, try to remember that a parenthetical is really more for the reader so that they're able to understand either who the person's talking to. That's an important one. You know, if you have like 3 people standing in front of the character and they say one line to Jeff and another line to Julie or something, you know, okay, that makes sense. Don't overdo them, though, I think would be the primary note to give you to parentheticals. If you have, I'm just throwing this number out here, don't, again, you know, don't use this as if this is law. But if you have more than 10 parentheticals in your whole script, really ask yourself the question, why? Are they absolutely necessary? More often than not, I see parentheticals being used to make sure the reader, or eventually, you know, the actor or the director, understands just how that person is saying the line, which technically we don't need to do unless, again, it's so like the line itself kind of contradicts the action that the person's taking. You know, there's a very specific reason to be using the parenthetical, as opposed to just let's explain how the person's saying the line. That's when their parentheticals are just way overused. Sometimes you can cheat a little bit and use a parenthetical for an action, which is nice sometimes, but you really want to keep it short. If you start going down lines, like if you're writing in your parenthetical and it goes like one line and then it goes, you know, there's only a little small amount of space that the screenwriting format actually allows you to use, and it starts going down, you're saying too much. There's no need to put an entire action line within a parenthetical. But you know, if like you want, as opposed to writing a scene direction line of, you know, he throws the stick, you could cheat a little bit and have, you know, Jason and then the parenthetical, you know, throws stick and then you use the dialogue. You can do that sometimes. Again, don't overuse them. They become kind of annoying for the reader. They really slow the read down, but it's also kind of as if the writer is trying to inform the actor, here's exactly how you're supposed to say the line. Your scene and the emotion that has been hopefully created within the scene, who they're talking to, what we know about this character, what they're saying, all of that should be inferred. You want to allow the reader to participate in the scene. A parenthetical, sometimes it takes me out of it as a reader, and I'm like, oh, okay, they're supposed to do that. But if you feel like you absolutely need the reader to understand this is what's occurring, or this is what the person is saying and why, I should say that differently. Here's the emotion behind the line, because it's different than what the line might read. It's okay. It's okay to do that. In terms of the formatting, it should be directly below the character's name. Sometimes I see, you know, like it's off to the left here, and then, well, you guys are seeing it in the opposite way, so it'd be here, and then right after it starts the lines of dialogue. We don't want that. That's just improper formatting. You want the parenthetical right below the character's name. General rule for parentheticals: if you don't have to use them, don't. I think this is the easiest thing to remember. Scene headings. So this is a big one. And I might show some examples. I think I'm going to wait for the examples at the end. One little rule that I learned way back when in college, and then it just I kept understanding, oh, this is kind of what they're doing. It wasn't something I read in a book. A teacher didn't necessarily say you have to do it this way. But the general rule from a production standpoint is that you kind of start high above, then you get a little bit closer, and then you get a little bit closer. In other words, it would be interior, Max's house, hyphen bedroom, hyphen, you know, closet, if you even wanted another closet. That this is really just as an example, but you see what I'm doing. I'm trying to start from bird's eye view, we get into the room, and then we can get a little bit more specific. If you have some form of a city, you don't always have to put the city in there, like Chicago, Max's house, Max's bedroom. We're going to know we're in Chicago because this is the setting that we're providing for the story. We don't always have to put the name of the town, the name of the city or something. That's the basic stuff. So you can start from bird's eye view, get a little closer. From a time standpoint, day or night, try to just use day or night unless you absolutely have a very specific reason to use anything else. Later is fine because it is referencing time, but you're that sometimes is a little bit of a cheat because you're staying in the same location or something. And then, a period of time passes, and then you can use another scene heading and say later at the end of it. Really, I would say you could just cheat and choose or select scene heading in your screenwriting formatting software. Just select that option and just write in caps later hyphen. We're still in the same room, and it's easier to read for the reader. You don't necessarily need to, copy or repeat the same scene heading, because I'm technically already in that location. So even though you may be saying later, you don't have to put that scene heading. If it's much later, if the sun has gone down and everything has changed in terms of where the people are in the room, and it really does feel like a new scene, then you'd want a new scene heading, and you can say later. But that is something you can cheat a little bit, as far as that reference to just write later hyphen and keep going. You still want some kind of visual description under the later, just to kind of get us into it a little bit, unless the characters don't move. You see, like, everything is relative. Like, if the characters are sitting down around a campfire and they're talking away, and then you just say later, and then the visual description is we're all just sleeping where they were sitting. You don't need that much of a visual description. So in terms of that cheat, you can do that a lot with scene headings. If you're staying in the moment in a way, like if you have people, like, let's say there's a party and there are 4 or 5 people in the living room, and you write, Max's house hyphen living room night hyphen night, and the scene occurs, and then you are technically in the same area. Like, you could just say kitchen, and there are other people in the kitchen, but it's still the same construct of a scene, right? You could just say kitchen hyphen. I know I'm in Max's house. I know it's the same time. I don't need to write same time. We're just moving into the kitchen, and then we continue with the scene. You can cheat like that sometimes. And it's a nice, easy, clean way to get the page moving. It's easy for the reader to understand. It's, scene headings, what they do to a reader's brain is it's almost like a restart. There's like this kind of unconscious something new. So the reader's brain then is thinking, oh, I might be in a different location entirely, or we have a whole new thing starting. And a scene doesn't have to only take place between scene headings. You can have multiple locations within one particular scene. And so the reader then is thinking, well, if I see a scene heading, we might be starting a new scene. Entirely different location, different people, different time of day, different tone, emotion, feeling, the point of the scene. So the reader's brain is kind of anticipating this. So we want to be purposeful with scene headings. Don't overdo this idea of, the cheat where it's just bedroom hyphen or something. Just, again, be purposeful and understanding of the reader's experience. The best thing you can do in terms of understanding scene headings, read a ton of scripts. It's totally free. You can see what everybody else has done before. And the more you read, the more you understand the flow of those headings and why they exist. So just read a ton of scripts. I could just end the webinar right there. In terms of time of day, like I said, try to stick to day and night. It's just that much simpler. Unless your story, again, see, everything's relative. But if your story has a very particular ticking clock to it, like it only takes place over the course of maybe 2 or 3 days or something, like into your entire story, then it makes a little more sense to go morning, afternoon, night, because now we're a slower progression through the story, and there's a purposeful time-related, situation to the whole story. 24, like the show 24, would literally put the time like 3:23, but that's on purpose. It's because there's quite literally a time reference for the show itself. So the easiest thing to do, day or night, once you start doing all these things like evening and morning and dawn and what's the other one? Sunset or whatever, the reader is just not even going to pay attention after a while. When I'm reading, and I read very quickly, most readers who read a lot do, I'm just glancing at the scene heading. Where am I? Okay, cool. Like, I don't actually read it out loud in my head. When I come to a new scene heading, my brain is not saying interior, Max's house, bedroom, night. Okay. And then I go into this, like, I'm zooming through it. I'm just noticing it. So if your scene headings are really long, sometimes I even see them wrap around to the next line down. It's almost like it's just too much information. So just try to keep them clean. Sometimes you might want them to be a little bit longer because you want to slow the reader down. That's okay. Again, all of this is technically okay to do. You just want to be aware that of the reader's experience. That's the first kind of line of defense that you have to get through. Somebody's going to read this before they're ever going to shoot it. And so it has to be easy. It has to be clear. You can name certain restaurants, like, if you want to give a particular name, as opposed to just saying restaurant, if it's like Luigi's restaurant, there's probably an assumption this is a pizza place or it's Italian or something or whatever, or if it's just like, Mary's Greasy Spoon or something, it gives a little flavor. But again, there's a tonal reference to that, there's a feeling the reader gets, so it better match the tone overall of your project. There are a lot of little things to think about scene headings. I could go probably even longer. Let me see if there are any questions here. Oh boy, we got a lot of comments. Okay. So holy cow. Okay. So Michael's saying, can you please use examples of everything you talk about? So I will, Michael. I know this is a lot of information. And these are, wow, a lot of questions. You know what, everybody, I think your best bet is to put it in the Q&A box, because I'm going to miss these. And half of the webinar is going to be spent answering just these questions. So I want to go through all of this stuff that I have listed, because they're all important. And I'll hit your questions, I promise. And Judy is saying, is there a whiteboard to accompany this? There is not. So I'm aware this is a ton of information. It's going to be a lot easier if you can see it. I am going to show examples, so we can just, if we can be patient for a second. But I love all the questions, so don't stop asking the questions. Just put them in the Q&A box. Let's see here. Anything specific? I've noticed meanings may be interpreted differently when the reader is either younger, which is why I'd use parenthetical. Yes, sometimes, but we don't know how young that reader is going to be. I would just be really careful with parentheticals, everybody. They can easily be overused. If I see one, I'm like, okay, like I actually hesitate. This is just me because I'm coming from an educational place, but I'm kind of forewarning myself just a little bit, like, okay, how many of these we're going to be using, I have a script in French and English if they speak. So these are a lot of questions that are not necessarily pertaining to what I just want to go down my list. So definitely put these questions into the Q&A box. Somebody's asking about flashbacks. I'm going to cover flashbacks. I have some visuals for that. Let's see here. So Christy this is about scene headings. So what about referencing time period in the scene heading? For example, exterior Jersey Shore sometime in the 1980s. So it's tricky because it doesn't, I would say don't put that in the scene heading because it's easy to miss that. I would make sure that the visuals are showing us this is sometime in the 1980s. What allows us to know that? Because when we tune in as an audience, we're not seeing, unless it's said on the screen, 1983, we're just seeing the visuals. What's the location? What do the cars look like? What's everybody wearing? And what is their hairstyle? Like these things are what shows us that it's sometime in the 80s. If you want a specific year, or if you actually want that to show up on the screen, then you would write super : sometime in the 1980s. It's much easier for the reader to see that than hiding it in a long scene heading. Yeah. So it's a good question about subtitles and everything. We'll get to that. Let's see. Yeah. Will there be a one-sheet summary of today's questions and answers, just an outline of your tips for each subject and topic that came up? So Danielle, I apologize, there will not be. The recording will be available and you'll be able to go through the recording. I try to keep these webinars as simple as possible. Once we start getting into handing out and emailing different documents, and it turns into a full-blown class, and then I'm getting a whole bunch of emails and the time commitment, just because we have so many people, hopefully you understand. But the recording will be available probably within less than a week, and you'll be able to rewatch it as many times as you want. Let's see here. Yeah, I would say, kind of like what Nicole is saying here, the film Call Me by Your Name is bilingual, great example. Everything Everywhere All at Once, that script is really interesting to read. Like they have the Chinese language here, the English language here, pretty much through the entire script when it's necessary. It's a ridiculously long read when you do that, but read as many scripts as you can to see how somebody else is doing that for the bilingual films. It's technically easier than you think. You can really just write in the scene direction, the characters will be speaking this in Spanish. Like you could literally just get away with that. And then you just write the script in English, or the reverse. It's a Spanish written screenplay, but you have to reference the characters will be speaking English, whatever it might be. Okay, so the next one, transitions. This is as simple as like cut to, dissolve to, fade to. There are a whole bunch of different options that you can choose. You can technically write anything. You could even say flashback to. The key about a transition is that it's down on the bottom right-hand side of the page. I guess for you guys, it'd be over here. It's down on the right-hand side of the page at the right-hand bottom of the scene, which then transitions us into a scene heading because we're moving into a different location, most likely. The general rule is use them when you need to. It's totally fine to use transitions. They exist. If it wasn't okay to use them, they wouldn't exist. What we don't want to do is act like the director. And this kind of leads to an overall rule for writers who have yet to be produced. Please, and I'm begging you all to try your best to stay away from camera references in your script. I know you read scripts a lot and you're like, well, they did it this way. They did it. Well, this is also written by writers who are either going to direct the project themselves, or they're going to be very involved in the production, or they've sold projects before. There's a little bit more of a trust level in those writers in terms of, from other people in the industry. They can get away with things a little bit more. For us writers who have yet to make a career or, get something produced, or we're not going to direct it ourselves, please stay away from angle on or we pan over, we see this. Every now and then a we see is understandable, but I would try to stay away from it, because what it does is that it reminds the reader that they're reading a screenplay and not just immersing themselves in the story. It actually takes the reader out, especially when you have angle on, camera pans up. You're being the director now. It's our job to paint an emotional picture without saying, here's exactly how the camera person is going to be shooting this. We want to be painting the mood through word choice, through reactions from characters, through the description of an alley. What does the alley look like? What is the sun? How's the sun shining through the windows? That helps us paint the tone, which then the director will take, and he or she will then talk to, his or her director of photography, and they're going to craft exactly the type of angles, et cetera, et cetera. A screenplay is a collaboration. It's an invitation to collaborate with other people. That's the whole point of a screenplay. So you as the writer, it's not necessarily your job or responsibility, unless you are going to shoot the script, to reference all of these camera angles. And all the production references. Some people could argue that a cut to or some form of a transition is a production reference. You could argue that, but really what a transition can do is give a little bit of a break in the mind or head of the reader. It adds some white space in between scenes. It's kind of like a little bit of a breather for that reader to then move into the next scene. We understand that this is a transition of some kind. You don't have to get over the top with it. It's not like after every single scene you need to add a fade to or a cut to or a dissolve to or swipe to or whatever. Sometimes you can use it, but for artistic effect, because that does get referenced by the eyes of the reader as we're going through the script. So sometimes it's okay. It's another one of those things that you don't want to overuse. I like using them, but for purposes of, like, if I'm going to have a cut to, it better cut to something in relation to the previous moment that I just saw, either for comical reasons, or it's, kind of a reference to this idea of same time, which I see a lot in scene headings, and it kind of drives me a little crazy because the whole movie is linear. We're watching the movie linearly, even if you might be going back and forth in time, or certain things might be happening at the same time. They're not actually happening same time in the script. I'm not reading the scene here, and then my eyes can't read them at the exact same time. You could reference in the scene direction at the same time while they're in the kitchen, then it's like, oh, okay, fine. But there's just something about it really does something different to the scene heading when I'm seeing same time, because it changes my brain. Again, this is one reader. Other people may be completely fine with it. We don't have to be overly specific with some of these things. Don't overuse transitions. The cut to can sometimes reference that things are happening at the same time because we're cutting to it. Just think visually. I kind of hit show, don't tell. So we have to remember that this is a visual medium. We don't want to just explain things in terms of how people are feeling or what they're thinking in the scene direction. Same with dialogue. But we want the scene direction to be directing the scene without being the director. I know I'm kind of being a little bit of a hypocrite with that, but we are painting the visuals of the scene. We don't really have time to explain things in the scene direction. Nobody, when we're reading a screenplay, we want to consume it. When I'm picturing the visuals, I actually don't say the words in my head. I'm just consuming the words, and then it's creating the situation and the mood and what I'm seeing. And then I go into the dialogue and I'm reading the dialogue. And so we don't really have the time to explain things and tell things in scene direction. In dialogue, sometimes you need some exposition, but a character is not always going to be saying exactly what they're thinking. Even when they're trying to explain something and just give exposition out about a situation, they're still going to be coming from who they are, their personality, their beliefs, etc. So, the general rule, I quoted this, out of my head a few months ago, that when people sit down to the couch and they say, what do you want to watch tonight? They don't say, what do you want to listen to? We are experiencing a visual experience. We want to see things and participate in those visuals and infer as audience members what it means. That's the whole point. The dialogue then becomes commentary on everything that's happening by way of the very personal, emotional personalities of who these characters are. They're going to be coming from who they are. They're going to be speaking from that place in terms of what they want, why they want it. The dialogue is a whole other webinar. It's not easy to teach, how to teach or how to write amazing dialogue. But show us, don't tell us. We don't need to over describe visuals. Here's the visual. You can get a little artistic with word choice, but we don't need to overdo it. Let's get into scene direction. So there's a lot here with scene direction. I will show some examples for this, and then I'll bounce to some of the references to the scene headings and other references I've already discussed here, because they do show these things. I'm going to show the script to A Quiet Place. I'm always a little scared to show this script because the writers really did something very, very different with the script to A Quiet Place. But the movie was very different. I'm going to make this a little bit bigger. It was virtually a dialogue-less script. The reason why I like to share it, though, is because there's very little, if no, dialogue throughout the whole script, and yet the page is still very clean. They do use a lot of the, nuanced moves that writers can use, capitalizing words, bolding words like cry. They underline a lot of things, but that's because this is an entirely visual movie. They're focusing the reader's eyes on very important things. Sometimes they capitalize an entire sentence. These are examples of things that you in your script, if you're writing, a so-called normal script that it has dialogue and scene direction, unlike A Quiet Place, that you can use these things sometimes. And so it's a good script to read for education purposes. Just don't do exactly what they're doing, because you likely don't need to. If you're writing a screenplay that doesn't have any dialogue, yeah, have at it, because that's almost like an art piece. You could argue A Quiet Place was an art piece, is a horror art piece. It was something that was just really interesting. And so they had to write the script that way. They had to keep the reader's attention, which they really do. But at the same time, if you just look at this page, it's really clean and easy to read. Every scene direction line, other than this one down here, and I'll explain why it's so-called okay to do what they do here. Every line of scene direction, or paragraph so-called, is only 2 lines down at most, 1, 2, white space, new one. And then they have extra, the typical space between this scene direction line and the scene heading. What's interesting is what they do here is they use the hyphens to kind of continue us into the next scene. We go from the farmhouse. They're using afternoon a lot, but this has a very particular role to play in the movie, because night and day is different, and it takes place over a relatively short amount of time in terms of the story overall. But nonetheless, they're moving from farmhouse, bathroom. See, they're even using the comma and the hyphen. It's okay to do this as long as you always follow that same format. They're going from the farmhouse, bathroom. A newborn baby begins to cry. I would probably even get rid of begins to, but it's fine. Newborn baby begins to cry. And then exterior wood, path, afternoon. April gets very still. Because of these hyphens, I understand April is hearing this cry. She turns up the volume on her hearing aid, just faintly through the frequency level, hear the baby crying. April stifles. There's a connection between these two moments, in spite of breaking it up with a line of scene direction. That's cool. It makes the read go a little bit faster. So little tricks like this mean so much. You probably could have used ellipses. You don't have to use hyphens there, but whatever you decide, again, do it every time. The reason for showing this page was for the scene direction, and almost every page is like this. It's so clean, in spite of the fact that it's all visual. There's no dialogue. The scene direction lines are not going down the page more than three lines. I think there might be a few pages in the script that they go maybe 4 lines, but they're ultimately keeping it clean. And I'm confident that was a choice by the readers or the writers. They wanted this to be still light on the eyes, in spite of the whole script being scene direction. So we want to remember that. We want to keep the page as clean as possible. One thing they do here, so this paragraph is 3 lines down. What's happening, though, is that we're going to a different area, a different feeling, a different mood, different character. Will arrives at his destination, out of breath and sweating. He reaches a rusted out tractor, searching for something. His hand squeezed back. It's like we're kind of, in a way, not starting over, because it is a continuation from previous moments here. The energy is still continuing from this location to this location to this location, but they're slowing it down a little bit. And because just consider what happens with from the standpoint of the reader. It's really easy to read a line and a half of scene direction. It just takes a little bit longer for the reader to read across the page with 3 lines down. Same with 4 lines down, 5 lines down, whatever. It slows the pace, which sometimes you want it to. You want it to slow down a little bit, or at least for the reader to catch a breath. I mean, we even have a reference, out of breath, so it actually allows the reader to go settle in. But then look what they do. They go down the page here. So we see a black fuse just barely out of reach, his fingers getting closer, closer, closer. I love the feeling of that, especially when you're dealing in such a visual movie, because they are purposely not capitalizing the C's, and then they capitalize all of that. Like a script can be artistic in a lot of ways. There's a reason for them not capitalizing that C. A reader probably wouldn't notice that, but it actually does register in the brain. So we go closer, 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 and it continues along this way. And they're capitalizing certain sounds, certain visuals that are really important. And then, of course, when I see all caps, I'm like, oh boy, something big's happening. But what they're doing in the sentence structure, which is really important where scene direction is considered, especially depending on the type of movie you're writing or TV show. It stands on 4 legs, hunched low, predatory, and dangerous. Its skin deep, dark red, the color of dried blood. This is, you could argue, not even a proper, grammatically proper sentence. They're actually kind of fragments, and good. Like, I don't need to read a perfectly grammatically correct sentence when you're just describing a monster that could kill the characters. I want to see the visual. There are no eyes on the monster's face, and as it saunters toward John and Mia, we realize it cannot see them. It's simply hear the baby's muffled cries. It's really simple in terms of how many words there are between the periods. We're not going on long run-on sentences. We're purposefully choosing short bursts of sentences, especially in really intense, highly emotional, suspenseful moments. That's because the scene's going to be paced that way. So the read has to be paced that way. So these are all really fun examples of things you can do in your screenplay. Like, you can capitalize things, you can underline things. They're doing it all the time, but that's just because this script was like an experiment that these writers were working on. Because look what happens once we really start going. Look how clean that is. Now we have this sudden centered line in the script. This is the longest walk of his life. And then we go to the next page. John is 30 feet away from the shed, 20 feet. I mean, look how engaging this is because of the type of script this is. Snap, it's just a sound. John looks down on horror, broken twig under his foot. The whole idea of the movie is, if you make a sound, the monsters are going to come kill you. That's the whole movie. And so, yeah, you can write the script this way, but that's because that's the conceit of the story. Like, that's what the most unique element is. And so we need the reader to feel that. I'm not saying I want you to use this in every one of your scripts, regardless of the genre. Please don't. You're going to annoy readers after a while. But they are purposely doing it for the purpose of the genre of the movie, the story itself. So you can have fun with it. It's okay to bold scene headings if you want. Make sure they're always bolded. One thing I will say, that the reason it works and I like it in The Quiet Place is because of how many words are on the page. It's easy after a while for the eyes to just kind of, go out of focus and you start missing the scene headings. I would say that if you have a heavy dialogue script, don't bold the scene headings. Then it becomes kind of like almost an obnoxious reference. Here's the scene heading. You don't have to do that. In this script, it makes sense because there are so many words on the page. It's all description. It's a nice way to organize the scene headings. Just bold them. So there are some TV series that, if you're writing a script that is similar to a particular show, try to find the script to that. Some TV series are purposely bolding scene headings, and that's a little bit more often seen in TV as opposed to features. So there's a lot to be gleaned from looking at a script like Quiet Place, because they use all of the techniques, all of them. One thing I will say that I like about this is that, well, a lot of things I like about it, but what I like is that they're highlighting certain really important visuals by capitalizing them. The old rule from way back when was that if there's a sound in the movie, it's capitalized. I don't mean dialogue, but if there's a sound, it's capitalized. That's where that rule comes from. As screenplays have evolved and people have read them differently, and they've become a little bit more of an artistic experience when reading, writers started capitalizing things that were just important, that they wanted the reader to see. I'm totally fine with that, as long as you don't overdo it. In this script, it's fine to overdo it because we're only seeing things and hearing things. And the whole idea is that we don't want to hear things because the monsters are going to kill us, So you want to be purposeful with the choices you're making with words on the page. I'll show you another example of, here's scene direction that I don't want any of you to do. The irony is that this writer is probably one of the best writers in Hollywood. His name's Craig Zahler, and he's gifted. He is a brilliant writer, so smart and so emotional. This is a horror Western that he wrote called Bone Tomahawk. He can get away with this because he's known, everybody trusts him, and everybody already knows he's extremely talented. So if we see all these words on a Craig Zahler script, I'm like, cool, I can't wait to read them. On a script from a writer that is unknown, this will annoy a reader when we see a giant paragraph like this. So I shouldn't say best advice, but a really important piece of advice I can give you: do not write a paragraph of scene direction like this. And then send it out as your first script, or if you're unknown, just don't do it. Whether you agree with me or not, I don't care. The amount of screenplays that I read, the amount of screenplays that the ISA reads, you're only going to hinder yourself by chunking up these scene direction paragraphs. There's no reason to do it. At the very least, if you didn't want to change a word, just break this up. I know it's going to kind of extend your page count, but just go 2 lines down, 3 lines down, 2 lines, 1 line, 3 lines. It's, at least it's cleaner, and a reader will go, fine, I can go through that. But this makes me sit here, and I'm going to spend all that time, and I feel like I have to read every single word, when a lot of times when writers are, putting these big chunk paragraphs together, they don't need to. They just don't need to be writing that much. And a reader is thinking that, like, I don't know who this writer is, and this is like page 2, and I'm already seeing this, I'm going to be turned off. And Craig does this quite a bit, even though as you go through, you're still seeing, some lines of scene direction that are pretty clean. But here, this is really long. The general rule is try not to go more than 3 lines down. This guy can do it because he's like a rewrite specialist. All the studios have hired him. He's made a career out of rewriting screenplays and bringing emotion to them, and et cetera, et cetera. Now, what you'll notice, he sometimes switches things up here. He puts a little backslash, bedroom, O'Dwyer house. Most of the time, his scene headings are really simple. It's just a reference to the basic location. Sorry if I'm making anybody dizzy. Outer perimeter of Bright Hope. So, clouds conceal the moon, the small frontier town melts into the night. This is, again, that's a very artistic way of presenting a location. I would say, from a writer that I have not read before, I would say, well, what does that mean exactly? I'm not sure. I would want a little bit more of a reference to some specifics. Here's, again, bedroom, O'Dwyer house. I'm just looking to see if he always does it that way. But his scene here, he does, yeah. So he always keeps it that way. This is odd. I don't see it done like that very often. I don't think it's necessary, but it's Craig Seiler. The guy is, everybody trusts him. Yeah, he keeps doing it. OS technically just means off screen, but the person is in the scene. This is not a narrator. This is not somebody who is kind of, speaking down from God or something. The person is technically in the scene. They're just off screen. That's the difference between OS and voiceover. Voiceover, the person is not actually in the scene. They're talking over us. There's a very specific difference. For phone calls, if somebody is on like a speakerphone or something, you could say OS, but really you would probably just describe it in the scene direction, saying, Samantha speaks through the phone speaker, or you could just add one parenthetical through speaker, and then continue the dialogue back and forth between Samantha and Arthur as they're talking on the phone. The reader will understand. They're not going to go, wait a minute, did Samantha suddenly appear in the scene? We don't need to overdo it in terms of trying to describe things. But OS specifically means that character is technically in the scene. They're just off screen. Again, huge chunk paragraph. Just don't do this. Don't do that. He's kind of changing it up here a little bit. Sheriff's Office and Jail of Bright Hope. I would just say Sheriff's Office - jail, and I probably wouldn't even worry about Bright Hope, but there's a specific reference to a location here. So we're there are multiple, towns or areas where the characters are experiencing things. So he is saying Bright Hope. This is the type of script that I would read only for emotional resonance, as for examples, like to get examples of how emotional a script can read by word choice within the scene direction, not for formatting. This writer can pretty much do whatever he wants. It's like trying to read a Quentin Tarantino script and go, well, Tarantino did it. Please don't ever say that to me. That is not something that counts. He's going to make his own script. He makes up his own rules. We have a little bit of time left. I wanted to show you some things for flashbacks. I knew this was going to happen. I'll go a little bit longer today, everybody, but I do have calls that I have to get to. So I want to show this because this is talking about flashbacks, and I said that I was going to talk about them. So this is from a very cool Instagram account that I have no connection with. They're not paying me to promote them, but it's called The Script Reader. If you're on Instagram, you can follow this person. I don't know who it is. And this person is always putting up really cool little visual notes saying, do this, don't do that. And so you can learn a lot from this free Instagram account. And this is pretty smart. I like that this person is doing this. How to write flashbacks. Yes, you want to start with begin flashback, : and then you get into the scene like they're doing, blah, blah, blah. I'll talk about continuous in a second because it's so important because I see it all the time. But anyway, truck, blah, blah, blah. Remember to also indicate when a flashback ends. So yes, end flashback, and yes, period. because boom, now it gives just a visual reference to end. So you do want to reference begin and end. You can do the same exact thing with montage. Montage is basically the same exact thing. Okay, do this when only one scene is in a flashback. You could use parentheticals in the scene heading, flashback, present day, or flashback, present day. I would probably prefer not using the parentheticals around it, but some people might like to do that because it does draw the eye a little bit. If it's just one scene, I get it. I think you could probably do the same thing as you did on this page. Begin flashback, end flashback. I think this person is saying you could also do this. You know, I would argue that anyway. There are options, but again, as long as it's uniform and you're doing it the same time or the same way. Another example, interior bar night flashback, back to scene and back to scene and present both mean the same thing. So you could do that if you want. I would prefer back to present. Back to scene doesn't really make sense in my head because I'm like, well, I'm in a scene. which scene, you know? So present makes a little bit more sense. Again, this is if you have a really short moment of a flashback, you can put it in the scene heading. That way you're not taking up a whole bunch of page space and you can just keep it on the same line. That's totally fine. Again, as long as it's easy for the reader to see and understand, it's okay to do it. You know, there goes to that question. Is it okay to do this? How to write flashbacks is it's okay to place flashback on the right-hand side of the page. Flashback 2, again, just remember to indicate when the flashback has ended. So either back to present or end flashback. Either way is fine. If you have a longer form flashback where it takes place over probably the course of a page or something, it would make a little more sense to say end flashback because the reader may, after a little bit of a while, forget they're in a flashback, you know? So I wanted to show that just as a way to give you some visual references. It's totally fine. Like this person's putting 1978, 1975. I, as a reader, might miss that. You know, you might want to just consider putting it in the scene direction. But what all of this says, all of what I told you, you know, in terms of everything already, and versus what you've seen in Craig Zahler's script, Bone Tomahawk, what you've seen in Quiet Place, and then, of course, what you're seeing here, you can kind of do whatever you want as long as it's simple and as long as you're keeping the same uniform and it's easy to see. Once you start making things all messy, you could argue that A Quiet Place is a little messy. Like, there's a lot happening on that page. But again, that movie is so different. Tony, I'm just scared reading the script. I think she's talking about A Quiet Place. Could we, Ava, could we do a part 2 of this webinar? I've got more questions. I am going to answer questions now. I'm going to go a little bit long. There is a lot more that I could cover, honestly. One thing I do want to share, I'm going to put this in the comment section here so you can see it. Oh, I do want to share continuous. So I'll hit this first. Something that drives me a little nuts when I'm reading screenplays is passive word choice, especially when I'm reading something like a log line where I just want to get the script or the story down. But we're talking about page formatting here. So passive word choice versus active word choice. Discovers, realizes, tries to, starts to, begins to. If it's purposeful that the visual that I'm the reader seeing where someone tries to do something but then can't, has to pull back or suddenly stops, you know, begins to walk away but turns around, that is something specific. But too often I'm seeing it in this kind of passive way. He begins to cry. Is he crying or is he just beginning to cry? You know, if he begins to cry but then holds it back in, okay, that makes sense. But we want to be wordsmiths. We have, the only thing we have at our disposal, and shouldn't even use the word disposal, but our paintbrush are words. It's the only thing we have to use to try to get people's attention. So you have to be deliberate in what these words are going to mean to somebody else. I can't emphasize that enough. Continuous, before I hit some of these questions. I'll try to make this quick, and I talk about it a lot. I think I hit it in the 30-day challenge. Continuous is a very specific visual reference. This is not to tell the reader we're continuing from the previous scene. We are using continuous in a scene heading only for the reason of telling the reader that there is no cut in the camera. And there's an emotional resonance that comes from that. If we follow Jasmine walking out of her bedroom and then into the hallway, and we have a new scene heading that says interior hallway continuous, that tells me the camera is not cutting. The camera is quite literally following this person. Too often I have a reference like, interior Jake's house night, and, Jake's running around and he goes to the front door and he runs outside. And then it says, interior car continuous. And then Jake's in the car and he's like revving up and he's driving down the street. And I'm like, well, that's not even possible because there was an obvious cut. We cut from him running out the door. We were inside the house. The next shot is him in the car. I get it that it's continuing because that's just the natural motion of the scene, right? I just saw Jake running out and now he's speeding away in his car. Well, I can get that. I don't need a reference to continuous because it's assumed. It's only used when there's a literal no cut. We're following him out the door, onto the front porch, onto the sidewalk, to the car. And there's like the cameras follow. There's a different visual feeling to that, Anthony, OS or OC, they're basically the same thing. I see OS a lot more often. I would just use OS. Camera is a little bit more of a production related type of reference than off screen, even though off screen is, but off screen just leaves it up for interpretation a little bit more. I would just use OS. So hopefully that makes sense about continuous. I have a whole bunch of questions, and everybody, I apologize. Because I have so many calls this afternoon, I may not be able to get to all of these, but this is being recorded. You will be able to rewatch the recording. I love that so many of you are here still, that you want to know and hear from me. That means a lot. I will do everything I can to answer this. Some of the questions are going to be very specific, and I may not have time to answer all of them. Anonymous, what about referencing time period? I kind of covered that. I would just put it in the scene direction. Try not to cover it up in time period or in the scene heading, because a reader can miss that. You can just say it sometime in the 1980s. You can maybe put it in italics or something. Or if you want it on screen, say super colon sometime in the 1980s. Multilingual scripts, how to and when the standard needs to be in English. So yes, I would, if you're trying to submit the project to North American audiences, it should probably be written in English. However, if you have a character speaking another language, put the language in there. If you know how to write it, if you're writing in Spanish or German or whatever, put the language in there. It's kind of cool to see it. It's going to extend the page count of your script, because you then have to write out what they say in English, because people who don't understand that language need to know. So you could have a little bit of both. Doing that all the time, though, it's going to turn into Everything Everywhere All at Once. The purpose with Everything Everywhere All at Once is in the title. The script even read that way. The script was a panic attack. It's everything all on the page all at once. That's the whole point. So I wouldn't do that all the time. If you constantly have this, where characters are always speaking a different language, I would just be purposeful. If there are some scenes where there are Spanish speaking people, write it in Spanish and then add the English in italics below it. You could pretty much do whatever you want, as long as it is in the dialogue form, because people are speaking it, but also as long as it's uniform and it's the same thing, because a reader they'll skip over the language they can't read. They're not going to try to read Greek if they don't know the language. They're just going to go to the English. So you simplify, just be as simple as you can. It's same thing with this reference to, putting sometime in the 1980s in your scene heading or something. That technically makes it more complicated. You want to make it as simple as possible. Let's see. How would you do someone using sign language? You could just put it in the scene direction. First of all, read the script CODA, CODA. It's an amazing, beautiful movie. How would you do someone using sign? You just put in the scene direction. He signs this, and just say what it is, because we're not going to necessarily see the actual hand and finger movement. Once you get on stage or on location and the actors are doing it, they're then actually doing the sign language. But you just write it out in the scene direction. This is what this person says. Best websites for free scripts. I think the Script Lab has a really nice library. You do have to sign up for a free membership or whatever. That's kind of how they suck you in. Script Lab is technically one of our competitors, but they do have a really nice library. Or you could just Google name of the movie, PDF, screenplay PDF, and you'll find, more often than not, you'll find the script. Ezra, my characters are in a parked car. Then they stop at the crossroads and converse. Then they park the car in an alley. So I used later 2 times here. It depends on how much time actually does pass. If there is passage of time, like the way you were describing it, I was thinking that they're driving. Well, okay, no, so they're in a parked car, but then when you said, then they stop at the crossroads and converse. So again, as long as it's easy to see and understand, the later is okay, because you don't necessarily, because they're staying in the same location. They're moving to different spots, but they're staying inside the car. The later is fine. As long as you get enough upfront information about them in the car, the reader will remember that visually. Let's see here. Oh, Kara has some great references to free resources. Yeah, Script Lab, Script Slug, Script Hive, Simply Scripts, Daily Script. That's for the people watching the recording here. Let's see here. Do you critique scripts, and what are my rates? Good question, Brian. You can go to thestoryfarm.org. I do a lot more than just critique. So I do kind of have to put a little bit of a, caution. I give a lot of notes, not just on page formatting. I'm talking about concept, character development, structure, and then of course the words on the page. So it's more than just, a rating of your script or something. It's not just coverage. I really dig in and work with you in terms of what we can elevate. But you can go to thestoryfarm.org, and I have some call packages available there. Let's see here. Ava, what do you do regarding camera shots and including cinematic transitional shots? Don't do them. Don't do them. I often write transitional shots of example, a character screaming in pain in prison, and then next a scene, a baby is crying. So the sound carries through. Is that wrong? Can I keep including them from time to time? I think that's very cool. It's a great idea. So, I was kind of exaggerating with don't do them. In that particular reference, you just kind of like what we showed with, I think it was A Quiet Place. You could use ellipses or hyphen, kind of how the baby was crying and was kind of continuing into the next scene. We can just be deliberate with the word choice. The baby cries continues through and into the jail cell. And, and you maybe capitalize baby cries. Just be deliberate. There's really not that much. You don't have to overthink it. As long as you keep it simple, it really all depends on the word choice you're using in a simple way. In terms of camera shots, please don't do them. It's a little overwhelming. And I see it so often. And I hate to say this because I don't mean to be overly critical or mean or cruel. It does kind of show an amateur level of writing. I feel bad saying that, but I don't want you all to be thought of that way. And so try not to do those camera shots. It tells the reader this person thinks he or she is going to direct it, or they don't necessarily understand the purpose of this script. The purpose of the script is to get you noticed. Let me see the quality of this person's writing, because this movie will probably never get made, but it might get this person a job. And maybe 15 years later, we come back to the script and we get it made. That's an exaggeration. Please don't overreact to that. Your movie may very well get made, but it shows that. I'm just repeating myself. Please be careful with it all. Millie, repeated parentheticals, parenthetical use in a scene when someone has stopped speaking to someone, ? Character speaks to another person to communicate around person in the room, not being spoken to, but who's trying to engage in conversation. Scene heading / instead of hyphen. Townhouse. Oh, I would just keep the hyphen. I wouldn't do the / like Craig Zoller was doing. But in terms of repeated parenthetical use, I would just immediately say, don't use repeated parenthetical use. Someone has stopped speaking to someone. I mean, more often than not, you could just say that in the scene direction. There's a dead awkward silence. Everyone stops talking to each other. you know? Let's see, Ron, I'm struggling with one of my projects that has very little dialogue, similar to All Is Lost. Page count 32. I'm at 27 pages, even though it's an hour and 45-minute movie. That's difficult to believe, Ron. I hate to be so deliberate like that. Most, if not all, people who see a 32-page script will not assume it's almost 2 hours long. So I would read A Quiet Place and notice, the page count on A Quiet Place is, what is it? What did I do with it? Hold on. 68 pages. That makes sense to me. You're probably going to be looking at a 65 to 75 page range if there's no dialogue. Dialogue really, of course, extends the page count. 32 pages, that's tricky, Ron. I'm sorry to put it like that. That's a very particular type of script that I would have to look at to really be able to give you a lot of, specific thoughts on that. The general rule is a minute per page. Obviously, you can have a lot more happening on a script page that's going to take up more than just 1 minute. But it's hard to believe that a script page would be more than 5 minutes long. Maybe longer than 5 minutes, but you want the script to flow. That's a tricky one, Ron. I applaud you for trying to do a project like that, though, because that's really interesting. And you never know, you might get some people interested in taking a look at that. But just right off the bat, I hear 32 pages. I'm thinking there's no way that's 2 hours. So we might be a little off in terms of time count. Aren't transitions important for pacing? They can be, for sure. Yeah, they can help and aid in pacing. I just wouldn't overuse them. Lori, what about intercut references in a scene, like at a party? Oh boy, it's so relative to the scene. And it really depends on what you mean by intercut. You could just go to the next location that in a way you're saying it's intercutting. You're just going back and forth. If you start off at the top of the scene saying we're not going to say we, but intercut between Jason's kitchen and Julie's bedroom, just say it up front, and then through the scene you don't always have to use a whole new scene heading. You could just say Jason's bedroom, or Jason's kitchen, Julie's bedroom, Jason's kitchen, and we'll understand that we're intercutting, we're going back and forth. Parentheticals, I've already made the decision that when a character yells, I use caps. There's also a lot of singing in my screenplay, and I made the decision to use caps italic. Is that enough, or should I put in the action or parentheses, she sings or she yells every time? See, I was a little concerned with these questions. That's a big, and it's a really good question. I really don't know if I have much time to go through all these, everybody. I feel bad. But made the decision that when a character yells, I use caps. I would be really careful with doing particular things to the lines of dialogue. Since yours is somewhat of a musical, you can kind of get away with that. Gosh, my instinct is to say don't capitalize the dialogue, but I also haven't read your script, so I don't know if it may not matter. So it's hard to give an outright answer like that. There's a lot of singing in the script, and I made the decision to use caps italic. I will say that's going to be difficult on the eyes. If it's capitalized and italicized during the whole song, that's hard to read. I would just come from a place of, is it easy to look at? Is it easy to see this? If it's noted that the person singing, which doesn't necessarily even have to be in parentheses, but you could put it in a parenthetical, then it's just written as dialogue, and we understand it's being sung. Or maybe it's all in italics, because when we flip through the script, we can understand, oh, there's a portion here where the person's singing. I would try to get a script for like La La Land and see how they format it, because there's a lot of back and forth in terms of dialogue and singing. That might be your best bet. Why aren't we allowed to put graphics into a screenplay, videos and pictures? It's just not something that's normal, and it will annoy people. I think we've talked about that, Christy. It's your job as the writer to provide the pictures and videos through the word choice, because what pictures are you using and what videos are you using, because that's somebody else's creation and it's already been done. And it won't exactly be what it's going to look like on screen. So it's an indication or an invitation to collaborate. The pitch deck can use other forms of visuals, but it sounds like a lazy answer, Christy, but it's just not done. And if you try to do it, people are going to be like, "What is this? What am I looking at?" And I don't think you're going to change anybody's mind about that. Catherine, I always learned not more than 3 or 4 lines in a paragraph. Let's see here. I use I dot and E dot for interior exterior. Is that industry accepted? I totally fine. I would understand it. I would probably prefer the interior dot or int dot slash ext dot, interior exterior, but IE, it's fine. You're not saving that much space, by getting rid of the N and T and the X and T. Bit of an off question. How do you write fight scenes? Okay, so if this like a Jackie Chan type movie, is it necessary to write out every detail of the fight, or does production take care of what moves happen, and can I write it vaguely in the script? Try to find a little bit of a middle ground. If there are very specific moves that are for comical reasons, or it's in reference to something that, somebody was shot in the chest before and somebody's literally, punch them in a particular location, you can get specific to that. But you don't need to choreograph the entire scene. They are going to choose certain moves, but if there is a very particular type of move that's really important, then yeah, you can detail that. But again, as long as it's easy to read, everybody, I think the easiest thing I can tell you, please just read as many screenplays as you possibly can. I don't know how else to say it. You have the time. Actors read more screenplays than we do, which is ridiculous. It's completely absurd. That's our medium. We need to be reading screenplays all the time. It's the cheapest way to learn, and we get to see how everybody else did it. And then you're going to be able to kind of come at it from a place of, I like what they did there. It matches the tone of what I'm trying to do in my story. So I'm going to try to use some of that. But again, as long as it's uniform. Let's see here. Accents. Do you write it as it sounds? Yeah, try to write it as it sounds, but don't overdo it, because it's really easy to annoy the reader. You try to write it out phonetically and go, okay, I'm going to pull back a little bit and try to, the actor will be able to give it his or her own spin. But yes, you can write the accent a little bit. Notice in A Quiet Place, it only said music plays. Are you anti-naming specific songs in the screenplay? Absolutely. There's just no reason to name a specific song. Sometimes you can get away with referencing a song like this John Denver song or whatever. You can say that if you want, but it's going to be the music supervisor's job and the director's job to choose the exact song and the type of music. And to be honest, I wouldn't even put music plays, but in A Quiet Place, if music plays in that movie, that's not a good thing, because monsters are going to kill you. So they're probably not even referencing the movie music. They're referencing what's happening in the scene. Music plays, so there's a specific reason for it. What about something like CU : on his watch 9:50 a.m.? I wouldn't do a close-up. It's not our job to say we need a close-up right now on 9:50 a.m. You could just say in the scene direction, he looks closely at his watch, -9:50 a.m. And then it's the director's job to then decide, well, how close am I? We're probably going to see a shot of his watch, Let's see, to convey he is looking at his watch, should you just write he looks at his watch? There you go. Any advice on writing an animated script? I've read lots of animated scripts, lots of different styles. Just try to write it as if it's a normal feature. You're going to be more visually specific. You probably will have a little bit more fun with it in terms of capitalizing words, and because you want to feel, the reader wants to feel what it's going to feel like on screen, but it's basically the same thing. Thank you for sharing your expert. Thank you, everybody. I went through the questions. I didn't hit all the comments. I apologize. My mouth is very dry. Let's see here. Max pages for a scene. If a conversation is happening, does it need to be cut up, or can it go 7 pages? I would say if you're going more than 5 pages in a scene, really make sure you're not just rambling, especially in TV. How often do we actually see an 8-minute scene, 9-minute scene, where people just talking? There's probably some form of a chase. There's movement. There's action. We have a very short attention span for TV viewers. We are all TV viewers. Do I want to sit and just watch two people talk for 9-10 minutes? Because a 7-page, maybe it's 6 minutes. I don't care, even 5 minutes. It's a long time, you know? So there isn't necessarily like this is what the industry says, you cannot go any longer. Again, you can technically do whatever you want to do. But, and I'm focusing on this question because I get this question a lot, but I always tell them that if you're going over 5 pages in a scene, really just take a second and go, wait a minute, how much of this is absolutely essential? Am I just rambling? Are the characters coming from places that are personal and you know, intentional from who they are? Am I being unexpected, or are they just kind of responding to each other? How interesting is this dialogue? Because you better keep the reader's interest if you're going more than 5 pages, you know? All right, everybody. I think that's it for now. Christy, I did see your little comment about why do we only have words? It's all we can play with, man. I think we got to own that and have fun with it. Read as much as you can, not just screenplays. You know, one thing I remember from Stephen King's book on writing, which I highly recommend you all read. It's more about novel writing than screenwriting, but his book on writing is so fabulous and it's so inspirational. And he was basically saying, what are you doing trying to be a writer if you're not reading books? And I could hear his voice when I read it in his book, because he's totally right. What are we doing? Are we just fooling around? Are we just kind of being hobbyists? Or are we really taking this seriously? And if we're going to take it seriously, we have to be lifetime students. We have to be in college for the rest of our lives. This is a never-ending thing. We're going to be writing for the rest of our lives if you want to. So if that's the case, spend the time, however much time you have, to improve. And the cheapest way to do it is to read screenplays. I think that's a good way to end, everybody. I'm going to be on again next month. I don't know the topic yet. Felicity Wren and I are going to be teaching a pitch class starting March 7th. Hopefully we'll be getting some information out to everybody as soon as possible. And you'll be able to find that at thecraftcourse.com.